look at the Court of Justice, you can lodge a case in any of the 24 languages and you get a judgment at the end of the process in 24 languages. So that's what the institutions do.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Slator Pod. Today on the podcast, we welcome Stefaan van der Jeught. So he is the professor of EU constitutional law at the University of Brussels, VUB, and also a press officer at the Court of Justice of the European Union. Hi, Stefaan, and thanks so much for joining today.
Hi, Florian. Very nice to be on your show. It's a pleasure. And congratulations for the pronunciation of my name, because that's like the top 1% of people that get that, so
we practice.
non-Dutch speaking people.
We practiced, fellow Germanic speakers, okay. And also, as I said before, Swiss German is basically just h and ö and ü. That's so we're pretty good at that.
Congratulations. Right. Anyway.
So you're recording this from Brussels today or somewhere else?
Luxembourg, actually in Luxembourg.
Okay.
So based in Luxembourg, where the Court of Justice is. But I teach in Brussels.
How much of a commute is that?
Well, I teach in the first semester. So I'm full-time at the Court of Justice. I teach in the first semester. So that's quite a good combination. So it's not that much of a commute, really.
We talk about all kinds of things today. Very excited about this. Law, language law, European Union, so much to talk about. Multilingualism in the European Union. But first, tell us a bit more about your professional background. What initially drew you to law, and then how this interest in kind of the intersection of language and EU institutions came about?
Well, you know how a professional career goes, Florian. Sometimes it's like I've always been attracted to this intersection of law and language. I did Latin and Greek when I was in what is high school, right? That's already something that is, an interesting preparation for law and humanistic studies as such. So we did quite a lot, actually. It was still back then in the days when you had 9 hours of Latin and 5 hours of Greek as for the second year. So, I mean, you can imagine it was quite a lot, and a lot of philosophy. And then you rolled into the law, actually, because there you had quite a broad curriculum as well, with philosophy, with economy, with everything, and the law, obviously, as well. And then, I'm a Belgian, so of course, linguistic issues are never far away if you study constitutional law, which was my major, together with European law. So you're always talking about linguistic issues there as well in Belgium, having 3 languages. And then I started to work at the federal parliament, obviously also in a bilingual setting and job. I went on to the Court of Justice, where I was a lawyer linguist first, only a limited period of time, and now I'm one of the press officers. But you're always dealing with multilingualism, living in Luxembourg as well, 3 languages, and multilingualism even in my family, because I married, my wife is Italian, so we have a bilingual family in a trilingual country. So you can imagine that multilingualism is at the core of every single debate we have. So
And the debates are multilingual as well, or?
We talk Italian in the family. I talk Dutch with our children. My wife talks Italian with the children. So it works. It works.
With Greek and Latin, you got the bases covered for pretty much for a big part of Europe anyway. So
true.
It's same here. I mean, not Greek, but Latin continues to be in like the 7th grade for a certain part of the curriculum. You still have Latin about 6 hours a week. Greek is, I think, optional. I think they stopped the Greek about 30 years ago. What inspired you to do your PhD on language policies, but maybe on the, I think, conflicting language policies within the EU? What inspired you to do that particular topic?
Very good question, because that's what I was noticing when I was passing from, let's say, the constitutional national Belgian law to European law. I noticed that whereas in Belgian constitutional law, we have a lot of linguistic rights about what citizens can have and which language you have to use in which circumstances. And you actually don't have that in European law. So I noticed that the multilingualism was of a totally different nature in European Union law. And EU scholars, legal scholars, actually do not really address that issue. It was left, I'm talking about like 10 years ago now mostly, and still to some extent now, it was left to social linguists, let's say, talking about the phenomenon as such of multilingualism, but not having a legal take on it. And the legal take is typically looking at the linguistic rights. Do I have an enforceable right of using my language? What is the legal binding force of every linguistic version? Those kind of questions. No, they were looking at the phenomenon as such. And I saw that, yeah, as a nice opportunity with my background, of course, of making my PhD there, because what you see is that EU making an EU internal market, for instance, um, necessarily has an impact on national linguistic policies. To make it very clear, if I want to sell my products in the European Union, the linguistic situation is kind of a barrier because I have to label my products in various languages. And the same if I want to perform services, if I want to be a medical doctor in another country, well, I have to take into account the linguistic situation in that country. So there is a conflict there between the fact that you want to create one internal market and the fact that you have the mosaic of different languages in the European Union. And that was the thing I wanted to address in my PhD.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge challenge, but for the language industry that we're covering at Slater, obviously it's kind of one of the life forces, right? The multilingualism at the heart of the European Union, an economy as rich as the European Union with 20 plus languages. But let's take a step back and maybe if you can give us a bit of a kind of an overview of the history of language and multilingualism at the EU level. We don't have to go back and like start in the Middle Ages, but like at the founding of the European Union, the initial kind of smaller union, maybe 5, 7 countries, and then as it expanded, like were initial rules kind of written and then kind of just expanded to all the other countries, or were there kind of step changes as new countries joined the European Union? And yeah, just gives a bit of a historical overview there.
Yeah, that's interesting as well. When you look into that, actually, I looked at some of the basic documents and the negotiations when the European integration started in the 50s, right, after the Second World War, the Treaty on Coal and Steel, the Treaty of Paris, and then you see that the negotiations took place in one language, French, and the treaty, the very first treaty of European integration on coal and steel, was drafted in French only, and had legal force only in French. Um, so that was actually the very, very beginning. But straight afterwards, there was already a linguistic issue, let's say, or discussions, in the sense that naturally the French said, well, maybe we can just have everything in French. Then we can have these institutions work in French. We can have the laws in a reference language, which would be French. Um, and they met there was another point of view defended by notably the Germans, who said, no, listen, we are making laws here that are directly binding upon citizens, upon companies. So we have to have these laws in the various languages, in the language to whom of the people to whom these laws are addressed. So you see this, the two views immediately, and that never changed. Actually, that's something that has never changed. So what happened? There was an there were several attempts to discuss this theme, and at the end they decided essentially not to decide, because they said, well, we have four languages here, we're gonna give them all equal status. They're all gonna be official languages and working languages of the European coal and steel community, which then later became the European Economic Community, European Community, and the European Union. And that never changed. So the regulation, the very first regulation that was under the ECC, Regulation 1 1958, just said, well, all the languages are equal. They all have equal legal status. And that never changed. So in every enlargement, languages have been added. And we're currently at 24, as you know. So from 4 to 24. And the situation has never changed, actually. It's just language added with all equal status, legally speaking, obviously, because in practice you have a different situation.
And the decisions there are made mostly by the individual member countries, like which languages get added with enlargement, and maybe also
Yeah,
talk a bit more about kind of the key institutional stakeholders there for multilingualism at the EU level. Is it the Commission mostly? Is the Parliament driving some of it? Are there other committees? Is it, you know, the Council at the very top, or like who's driving policy?
that's two questions. The first question or the first issue is um, how did this did work in practice, right? If I
Yeah,
understand, with the 20 languages having equal status, but of course in practice you see that French was used primarily in the beginning of the European construction, and then you see a shift towards the mid 90s where you see all of a sudden more English, and then it really shifts towards a predominance of English in most of the institutions. Actually, one notable exception, the Court of Justice. Um, as to your question, then, who is driving this? Well, it's actually quite an autonomous process, and that's very interesting as well. In this basic setup where they said, well, we give equal status to all the languages. Um, it is actually so that the institutions get a sort of institutional autonomy, and so do the agencies. So they all kind of decide about themselves for themselves about which languages they want to use in an internal setting. So it is left actually up to the single institutions. And then maybe what you asked as well is, how does a language become a language of the union or treaty language, right? That is all decided between the EU and the exceeding member state. So it's the member state that comes up and says, we have these languages and they will be added. There are some limits to it because the language must have a legal status on your territory, in terms of the language in which you draw the law. That is the key element.
naturally so. Yeah. So in the mid '90s, I mean, I think that must have been a function also of like the Nordics joining, and then
Absolutely. Austria, Sweden joining, that is really the turning point in Finland. The enlargement of 1995. That's really the turning point where you see that English is more and more used.
because these countries have zero history in French at all, right? I mean, I guess Germany made an effort, and then, you know, obviously Italy and some of the others, it's kind of closer, but there's probably not much French teaching going on in primary school in Sweden and Finland. So
Obviously, it's more difficult to find people who are fluent in French and who are well versed in French who can actually work in the language. Yes, that's of course a challenge for some countries. True.
so before we talk about your book, and the second edition is out now, I want to ask a very big question. I mean, what are your thoughts about, is it even realistic for kind of any body politic to operate in like 25 or whatever 20 plus languages? Because here in Switzerland we have 4 and we're struggling. So, and that's why it probably converged on English, and now we'll talk about it later. It kind of, we're stuck with English now at the EU, even though, you know, Brexit. So yeah, just kind of a more philosophical question: how realistic is it, and what do you think about that?
It is realistic because you do it every day. I mean, look at European institutions and they work in 24 languages. So look at the Court of Justice. You can lodge a case in any of the 24 languages and you get a judgment at the end of the process in 24 languages. So that's what the institutions do. Parliament works in 24 languages as well. I mean, it is done, and it's done on a daily basis. Um, but it's only possible because you have a combination of multilingualism and full multilingualism with a working language or several working languages, and that's actually what makes it possible. The working language internally, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to do that. If you look at sometimes you see more and more now these films, these little clips coming of President Macron talking to other European leaders, etc. And you often hear they're actually speaking English among themselves. So you see that it's very much that it has become common to really communicate at the highest level in one lingua franca, which is then inevitably English. Yes. So I think that's what actually makes it possible.
Got it. So yeah, I mean, it is realistic by default because it's happening, and so basically you have the right to communicate in your language, but then, you know, obviously it would be almost impossible internally if you didn't have some type of lingua franca, and well, in that case, obviously it's English. Okay, let's talk about the book. I think we connected about 7 or 8 years ago over the first edition of the book called EU Language Law, like a standard for anything related to that topic. And now you just released the second edition. So tell us a bit more about the book, and then what prompted the update, and what were some of the kind of key changes since the first edition.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I appreciate that you give it some that you give it some attention and some publicity here, as you did on the first edition. It's very nice, and well, you know, it was a lot of work to do the edition, because once you start looking at the text, you want to sort of improve it, right? So you can always, it's not just updating it, you also improve it, you make it clearer, you make it, so that was quite a lot of work, and of course, 10 years have passed since the first edition in 2015. So yes, many things have changed. There are new laws, there are new directives, new regulations that are relevant. There are new case law from the Court of Justice, notably. So I put that all in, so it's an updated version for all people interested in linguistic issues related to EU law. So that was a big update. Actually, I was kind of surprised myself to see that there were so many things. I had continued doing research on the same topic, so I had many things ready. So in that sense, I was kind of prepared. Um, the things that have changed, well, on the one hand, you see that there is now a process of formalization. What I talked about earlier when talking a bit about the historic development, I said, well, it's all a bit sort of non-formalized often, right? It's left to the institutions, it's left to the. But you see that there's now slowly a movement towards having a bit more transparency about linguistic practices, where, for instance, the European Public Prosecutor and Eurojust, they actually say, well, we work in English internally, right? So we have our working language English. So that is something of an openness that was not there before. So you find some elements there. Um, Other things still remain very much under the radar. Issues like the linguistic impact of European Union law on internal market issues, for instance, that's still actually quite unchanged. So these issues are still not really addressed in EU law, or not even in scholarship as such. So in
And
that sense, it remains relevant.
when you're writing this, who's your key kind of audience that you have in mind when you're writing this? 2, 3 different
Well, I'm
cohorts.
a lawyer, so it's like writing for lawyers primarily. So it would be people dealing with EU law, but I noticed that actually most people interested are probably linguists working in the field of European multilingualism. So they're very much interested in the legal take on issues. So I think it's complementary to their research as well. So I think it's mainly those group of people, and then you're talking about so lawyers, civil servants, academia. That's actually what I notice of where I get feedback from. That's a target group.
And the original was written by you in English, or
Yes, absolutely. It was
yeah?
written in English. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I did my PhD as well in English. If you write about EU law, then it's kind of logical that you write in English, because you don't write for your own linguistic group. You write for the whole of the European Union and the legal community. So that is yeah, that gives it a much broader audience, obviously.
There could have been a translation. So I'm asking almost kind of a kind of devil's advocate. Like would it have been significantly harder for you to write it in in Dutch, for example, or some other, like, would it have been possible? Like sometimes for me in business, I struggle having a business conversation in German sometimes, which is my native language, like because I'm lacking all the terms, like on the top of my head, because I do so much in English. So maybe in your case, would it have been very tricky to do that?
In Dutch, that would have been possible because, of course, yes, I work in Dutch as well. I teach in Dutch, so that's not that wouldn't be an issue as such. In other languages, it would probably have been more difficult, because it's true that if you write in Dutch and you write in English, those are the languages that come most commonly to me. Although I work a lot in French as well, but still, I must say that I prefer writing academically in English. It's also because a lot of the sources are in English, so logically you have everything at your disposal in English. And as you say, you work uh, well often in the language, so you're familiar with all the correct terms and the way to write academically as well.
And then there's I think we picked it up in the research before, like that you're right about the paradox at the heart of EU multilingualism, that kind of the EU enshrines equal authenticity for all 24 official language versions in EU law, but citizens cannot fully rely on their own language versions to determine legal obligations. So did I summarize this correctly? And yeah,
Absolutely.
tell us more about this, like
Yeah,
specific
that's something
examples.
that we forget as well. That is that when I explained that the solution was to give equal authenticity to all the languages, um, the French point of view actually made sense as well because they said, listen, we have to have one reference language. Then you know if there are discrepancies between the various language versions, you know which language actually holds true. So that makes perfect sense because often like that in legal orders that you say, well, you have multilingualism, but you have legally one language that still is the one that is authentic if you want, or that's the one that is binding if there is any kind of dispute about discrepancies, divergences. And I mean, if you translate a legal text from one language into another, that inevitably you will have some kind of discussion about whether this is exactly the same or not. So you always have that discussion, especially, not least, but especially in legal text. So yes, what happens is that you actually have this paradox because on the one hand you say, well, listen, if I send the text to all the citizens and the natural legal persons, as lawyers say, so companies and citizens alike, we send them their texts, we have their directives and and the regulations, we have them in the language of everybody, then everybody can have that in their own language. So that enhances, of course, legal certainty. And it does. It's wonderful. But on the other hand, you have the problem of discrepancies. And what happens then is that if you happen to have your language version, you base yourself on that language version, and there seems to be a problem with that language version, well, then case law of the Court of Justice says, well, listen, you cannot actually look at your language version and take it for granted in isolation, just base yourself on that. You should actually compare it with the other language versions, or at least some other language versions, so that you can be sure that you have understood what your obligations and rights are. And that creates, of course, a paradox because on the one hand, you enhance it because you give it to the people in their language. On the other hand, you take it away because you sort of, yeah, say, listen, you have to compare it with other languages. So there is kind of a paradox. And there was a case that I always use of a Dutch farmer, and the farmer had interpreted wrongly. He had based himself on uh, the concept of tethering calves. He had calves and he had tethered them. And he had understood it, as was in the Dutch version, that he couldn't use a metallic tether. Whereas actually all the other language versions made it clear that you couldn't tether at all calves. So he was in violation of that rule. And he was criminally prosecuted. The case came before the Court of Justice, said, yes, listen, if we look at all the other language versions, your obligations were clear, dear Dutch farmers, so you had to follow that. But then the Dutch judge actually made an interesting decision because the Dutch judge said, yes, but this was actually based on a linguistic version that was wrong, that was understood wrongly. So he didn't punish the farmer in question. Now, regardless of the good faith of the farmer, it actually touches upon an interesting theme that I think that an individual should not be liable, as the Dutch judge decided, should not be liable for things that are actually wrong on a European translation level. So there, I think that maybe that could be somehow added to the legal situation, because that's not the situation as it is now. The guy was just lucky to find that judge, because in actual fact the obligations were clear from other linguistic versions. So that didn't seem fair to me. Let's say that doesn't seem completely fair to me.
Yeah, you couldn't expect the Dutch farmer to read the Portuguese version, right? Or in the English one. How could you?
Maybe now with AI, increasingly so, of course. So it changes rapidly, it changes constantly. So maybe I have to review my point of view there as well. So it's interesting times.
Yeah, let's talk about AI. Like it does, the new edition does talk about AI, digital governance. Like how does language AI influence EU language policy? I mean, from the outside, and now not thinking about revenues of the industry and this whole industry that's been built up, but it would seem like a huge net positive for working across a linguistically very, very diverse continent. So, I mean, do you see any downsides for like language AI coming in, like, or like as a user, it's like basically mostly positive.
It's fascinating. I think we're living in fascinating times in that sense, because it's incredible the level that you see of of translations through AI. It's amazing. So if you looked at that 10 years ago, that was completely different. And I'm just talking about it as an outsider. I mean, I'm not a
Yeah.
specialist, AI specialist, IT specialist at all. Just a user, simple user. So this is it's really remarkable. It's really incredible what is happening. So that I think it opens up a lot of possibilities. Things will change. There will be a lot of changes, but it opens up a lot of possibilities for multilingualism. It will actually potentially enhance multilingualism to a degree that we didn't think was possible some years ago. Um, so that's on the upside. I mean, in terms of communication, if you look at websites of European institutions, which are typically not always, I mean, the Court of Justice is an exception, that's really multilingual. The European Parliament is an exception, it's really multilingual. But some institutions, I won't name any, but it is not always all multilingual, right? It depends on the working languages that you use, or the versions that you have available. But here you see that there are a lot of possibilities of making AI translations, and then always with a disclaimer. I understand that, but it makes it available to people. So it really enhances communication and multilingualism. So that I think is extremely positive. And on the downside, I think there's no downside if you use it correctly, if you use it as a tool. If, of course, you think that you're going to replace all your linguists and all your know-how, then you have a problem. If you just see it as a means of doing away with people, or with jobs that you have now, then you have a problem. Because I think what changes is the nature of the job. If you look at legal translation, you look at, I think, more revision than actual translation. But the revision is very, very difficult, especially in legal translations. It's not just about the simple errors, but it's about the real revision as to conceptual differences. And that's you have to go deeper, actually. So you have to have people who are able to have this cultural sort of feeling, and this way of going from one legal order and its concepts to other legal orders and its concepts. So that's extremely important. So you will need even higher qualified people, I think, to do that. So I think that's very important, that we realize that you must actually, in some way, stay ahead of AI, and use it to preventively, to not make mistakes, um, to revise text, to correct text. I think the mistake that was in the text that I mentioned about the Dutch farmer, or rather inducing the Dutch farmer in error, it could have been prevented probably by AI. Because if you just run through it, then you would have seen that there was no mention of metallic in any of the other languages. So you would have spotted it probably with AI. I think that's fascinating.
There's maybe some translator somewhere when listening to this. Oh, I put the metallic in there in error, and look at that.
Errare humanum est. The mistakes are possible, and it's
You're right.
it's I've translated only for 2 years, but enough to realize the difficulty involved in it. So no, not far from me to throw a stone.
But I agree with you that the level of expertise is going higher right now, and it's going to have to go a lot higher. Maybe fewer people, but a lot of but much higher qualification, because to find any obvious error or even understand to read AI output and add value to it is just getting harder and
Absolutely.
harder. It's
It's
not going to go
extremely
away, but it's getting
difficult.
harder and harder. It's very, very difficult because
It's
it's kind
extremely
of
difficult,
in this
and
extremely good quality. It's wrapped in good quality, and you need to find that last little mile there to correct. Yeah.
absolutely, and it's needed also to still improve AI, because AI will use the texts as they are. So you must keep them at a good level to not go back there either, or to introduce mistakes that will repeat themselves inevitably. So it needs a critical mind, and it's actually it's going to be very, very difficult indeed, the task of revising.
So part three of the EU language law, your book, includes a 10-point roadmap for reform. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I wanted to actually make some practical proposals. I didn't do that in the first edition, um, because I think that if to summarize it, actually, I think that we are ready to have a bit more of a discussion about this, not leaving it always as it has been, like this is a delicate topic. We don't want to touch upon the linguistic issue. I think we should at one point, and maybe the time is right for that, because I think we should really need the discussion about how we organize languages in the European Union. And I think, well, I have this constitutional background, obviously, so that's my reasoning a bit. And looking back upon the Belgian example and other examples, what you really need is to have a protection of linguistic diversity, and a real legal protection of linguistic diversity, because we've talked a lot about English and about the role of English and the lingua franca, etc. I think that's essential. But on the other hand, of course, you want to preserve your linguistic diversity. That's one of the key aims of the treaty as well. So national identity and language policy, and that's what the Court of Justice has brought forward in its jurisprudence as well, that there is leeway for the member states to have their own national language policy and to defend their national language or languages. So that's extremely important. But I think we have to see that as well in policies. For instance, if you have the medical professions and people coming to work in another country of the European Union, there is, of course, the aim of making it easy for people to move to another country, but there's still the linguistic barrier. And to what extent can you then ask people to learn the language before they actually move? I think we have to be careful there not to go too much and too quickly towards opening up, but giving the time for people to actually learn the language. I think that's important for people to accept the European project as well. And I think it's a legitimate claim of people that when they go and seek medical help, that they can have somebody that speaks their local language. So I think that those issues, for instance, I think they're very important. Also for products, the rules are very heterogeneous now. The union sometimes says, well, no linguistic issues, so nothing about language, or it leaves it up to the member states. Or it says, well, national languages, yes, as long as they have a European Union status, but not a regional status. So it's actually a bit of a haphazard thing. But there as well, maybe AI can help, because if you look at it labels. I mean, we could have a code to scan, and we could have it in all the languages we want. So we could make it easier there as well. I think there as well you could have a lot of help from AI in terms of making the internal market still more running more smoothly as to language then.
Interesting. You mentioned the not regional status, but what are your thoughts about kind of current events happening in Spain? I think Spain has renewed its effort to have Catalan, Basque, Galician recognized as official EU languages, but it seems like there's not too much appetite for adding another three to the 20 plus. So what's the why do you think there's pushback, and do you think it's important enough for Spain to do this, or
Very delicate issue, of course.
very delicate
It's
issue?
it's let me just first give you the legal answer. Actually, the thing about the treaty languages is a bit of it's not really enshrined in the treaties or in EU law as such, which languages can become treaty languages. As I said, it's something that is negotiated with the exceeding member state. So that's normally done when the member state actually joins, the new member state joins the European Union. So that is one thing. And then it seems to be a practice that the languages that are eligible to become a treaty language are those languages that have a legal status in the sense that they're used for making laws in the country at issue. So, for instance, Maltese or Irish, they're used in Ireland and in Malta as the legal languages. Even more so, constitutionally, they take precedence over English when there's a divergence. So, legally speaking, they have a very strong status, and that's why they also have a treaty language status. So, what is irrelevant in this in getting a status as to an EU language is the number of speakers. And that, of course, seems a bit unfair. If you move further towards the European Union, we're all citizens, we're all equal citizens, European citizens. So then it may seem unfair that a smaller language in terms of speakers has a higher status. So that is, of course, something that you should maybe politically address. And as a lawyer, the answer seems quite clear, and it's difficult to get the status for regional languages. On the other hand, you have the political debate, of course. So I do understand the request by the Spanish Prime Minister, the Spanish government, in that sense. And maybe I can pull the other card again, the AI card, because then, yeah, maybe again, AI could be helpful in the sense that maybe some status could be given to even more languages if it becomes more feasible in terms of workload, etc., in terms of, well, by using AI. So maybe there could be some more inclusiveness, because you have to consider as well, we're moving towards 30 languages. If you look at all the enlargements that are in the waiting, or the member states, the potential member states in the waiting chamber. So, I mean, and then obviously, yes, there may be maybe something in it. Um, maybe there could be political discussions, but that's all I'm going to say about that.
So let me just try to repeat that. So for clarity, it's very, very interesting. So you're saying, like, legally, it's hard for a language to have official EU status if it actually doesn't enjoy the same status within the actual country.
That's absolutely true, because
Okay.
the thing is, the legal reasoning. It makes sense. There's legal reasoning. European law takes precedence over national law and is directly applicable and invocable in the national legal order. So that means that you should have it in your language. That's the idea. And then we just, let's say, respect the national rules. If you have Maltese as your legal language in Malta, regardless of how many you are, well, then you have European law into Maltese, and then it's a perfect situation, legally speaking. Luxembourg is in a different situation. Luxembourgish is the national language of Luxembourg, but it's not used for making laws. It's not used for enacting laws. The laws in Luxembourg are enacted in French only. Well, then, of course, it's more difficult to say we want Luxembourgish, because actually you're asking more of the European Union than you're asking of in your national constitutional order. You see? So that is a bit the reasoning behind that.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask you about, can the EU learn anything from Switzerland? Switzerland learn anything from the EU in terms of language policies? And I mean, yeah, do you have any thoughts on that? Have you ever looked at Switzerland? Because obviously it's a little older than the EU, and it's run on, I don't know, 4 languages for a while.
I'm a great admirer of Switzerland and the Swiss system. So I mean, you won't get an unbiased opinion here. So I won't say anything about what you guys can learn from the European Union. But what the European Union can take in its constitutional order, I think, is a bit difficult under European Union law. But it's a territoriality idea, and that's what we have in Belgium as well. What we have in Canada, or what we see in Canada as well. With Quebec, for instance. So that's what you see in countries where multilingualism is organized on that basis. It's a bit difficult under EU law because, of course, you have the idea of just doing away with barriers, and the idea of territoriality kind of gives you the barrier again, right? Because you say, that's where my territory starts. So that's not what we want to do in the European Union. But still, come to think of it, it's actually a guarantee of peaceful coexistence of linguistic communities, because linguistic communities typically feel threatened. They feel that other communities are expanding. There are smaller communities. There are bigger communities, smaller languages which have a longer history, and so there is a sort of competition there. And if you have a constitutional system where you have clear divides and rules about which language you can use in which circumstances, then you often actually diffuse that issue, and that's what Switzerland has shown, I think. And to some extent, I think we need that in the European Union as well, a sort of constitutional discussion about the language policies and what can still remain for the member states so that their languages can flourish and that we have a real protection of linguistic diversity. I sometimes use the image of the Eurovision contest, where you have Eurovision. The idea is not that we're all going to sing. Well, I'm not singing or performing in English, right? The idea would be that we express our cultural diversity to some extent. But if you present it, obviously, it's difficult to present it in 30, 40, 50 languages. So that wouldn't be possible. So you need still a language that you can work together. And that, of course, would be English, that you use to some extent also in the member states, obviously, for administrations to work together, for justice departments to work together, for politicians to work together. But at the same time, you need this kind of protection for legal diversity for people within their own countries, I would say.
Protecting linguistic diversity, I think Switzerland is a good example on a much smaller scale, of course, with Romansh. I actually there was an article today in the newspaper here that apparently in 1938 there was a popular national referendum about making Romansh like a national language, and it was passed with 95% of popular support, and that's 80 plus years ago, and Romansh is still alive. So it's tiny language, 50,000 speakers, various dialects, basically German coming in from the north, Italian coming in from the south, and it's still alive. I mean, there's communities where it's, the kind of the day-to-day language. So it did work, that protection.
It's fascinating. I mean, the language, it conveys like culture, like ancient culture. If you look at the Arbrecht community in southern Italy, they came from Albania like 1,000 years ago when Skanderbeg was fleeing invasions, etc. So they came there. They formed communities mostly in the mountains, and they have kept their language. And it's amazing how history actually is conveyed to us and transmitted to us through the languages. So you have to keep that that linguistic diversity. So that is really an incredible richness of our continent.
I'll look this up. I wasn't familiar with this example, actually. So I'll look it up. Very, very interesting. There's usually, with linguistic conservatism, there's usually mountains involved. Like people are in some type of valley.
Isolated areas. It's absolutely true what you say.
So, like, going on a different direction. So as a professor at the university, like, how do you see the role of kind of education in terms of shaping that next generation of language professionals? We spoke about the incredibly high kind of expertise that's required, right? In kind of the age of AI. Like, what is a university to do at this point? How do you educate the next generation?
Yeah, that's a very good point that you make. Of course, very good question. It's a bit of a challenge because everything is changing. So you have to, I think, adapt your the teaching as well to that. Circling back to what we said about the nature of legal translation, for instance, changing, I think what it comes down to is really having critical minds who have a good preparation and background. Um, it's uh, it's very important there, for instance, to add, I think, more comparative law somehow that has disappeared a bit from the curricula. Whereas I think it's essential to have comparative law to see how these concepts have evolved, how meanings can depend on legal orders and specific situations. I think that is very important that law students then, particularly because that's the field I know, that they are familiar with the fact that one interpretation or one legal concept can have so many different meanings, also in European Union law, because then you have different layers now. In European Union law, there's this autonomous concept definition as well. So a concept can be in one language one thing, in another national language another thing, and then on a European level still another thing. So I mean, and then even depend on the context. So it's very complex and complicated, and I think we have to convey that complexity, and therefore you need a good cultural background. I think we have actually, when I was studying, we had, as I said, a very broad background. As I said, even Latin and Greek as a sort of preparation. I don't think we can go back to that. But we should beware of making or of forming people who just know the technical aspects of the law. You have to have a broader background with some philosophy, theory of the law, comparative law. I think that is getting actually more important. So there is a tendency, of course, to make it more practical, to say, listen, we do not have to form philosophers or whatever, but you have to be careful with that. You have to find the right balance. I must say, when I was studying, I had a bit too much philosophy because we did 2 years without actually seeing anything about the law. So that was too much as well. But maybe we should find the right equilibrium between the sort of broader background and the technical preparation, because that is what we really will need with the new sort of AI uh, developments.
Yeah, you need to be able to put things into a broader context, right? And not just
Exactly.
accept whatever comes out of the machine as kind of the actual result. I guess it's critical
Exactly.
thinking is very,
Exactly.
very
Yeah.
hard.
Exactly.
So, final question: if you were to write a third edition of EU language law, which I'm sure now
That's
you're glad you
not
wrote
immediately, but we'll see.
in
In
5 to
10
10
years.
years,
Yeah,
in
maybe.
10 years.
Yes.
Let's do some crystal ball gazing. What kind of changes or challenges would you expect to have to address in 5 to 10 years?
So that's actually that's a beautiful last question. Yes, well, we will be looking at the different AI fields. So that will be, I mean, if you see how that has developed, that will be incredible to see. We will also look at still more languages in the field of taking into account the enlargement. So we will have to look at more languages there as well. Um, so yes, and maybe there will be some discussion about, as I said, this constitutional framework that we can actually move forward in the European Union as well on that field. So I think though that knowing the European Union, it will probably still go on a bit like it is now, and you will see an increase in the use of English. That is for sure. So I looked, for instance, into before and after Brexit. Many people were saying, "Oh no, but now English is not even an official language of the European Union any longer." Well, it's not true, of course, but there will be a decline. Well, actually, the contrary was true. So it actually increased still, being a bit of a neutral language then, with the UK no longer being a member state. So I think that's what we probably will see.
I'm going to have to make it the second last question. So you're saying the English, so it's very paradoxical, right? So basically, because the UK is out, it now kind of made using English more of a neutral option. Hence, people chose it more because they're not like automatically, I don't know, taking a UK side. That's interesting. Who would have thought?
Yes, there is this interesting writings by a Belgian, Philippe van Parijs, about linguistic justice, and he develops these ideas in a wonderful way. Um, because there is such an idea of linguistic justice, of course. If you're a native speaker, then you always have an advantage if your native language is the language that is going to be used as a lingua franca. Necessarily so, because you're speaking in your own language. We're both of us now speaking in a different language than our own. We're not at a disadvantage. If I would be speaking to an English native speaker, I'm at a slight disadvantage. I mean, we're not in a discussion here, but you see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
So there is always that element, and that is, of course, something that has to be taken into account.
All right. Well, that was absolutely fascinating, Stefaan. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much for taking the time today. I'm looking forward to sharing this with the audience.
Thank you very much, Florian. It was lovely to talk to you.